The rain hammers the Scottish Highlands. November 1891. On a remote hillside, a structure rises that doesn't belong, a palace built for emperors, dropped onto wind-swept moors where sheep graze and tenants scrape survival from thin soil. The scaffolding creaks. Stone dust coats the air. Below, in temporary barracks, workers sleep four to a bed. Above, carved into the entrance arch, a motto reads, "For the glory of Scotland." But this isn't Scotland's glory. This is one man's vision. An industrialist who made his fortune grinding coal from Welsh mines and limestone from Irish quarries. Who paid labourers pennies while charging customers pounds. Who built this castle to erase the memory of his grandfather's cottage and his father's shop. The castle is Inverurie, or perhaps it's Dunrobin, or Floors, or any of 24 Scottish piles raised in the long Victorian twilight, when Britain ruled a quarter of the world and empire money flooded home to buy stone immortality. This is the story Britain doesn't advertise in its tourism brochures, the story behind the tartan romance and the stately home fantasies, the story of who really paid for these monuments, and what the empire tried to bury beneath the grandeur. This is the untold story the British Empire tried to bury. This is the story of a castle that shouldn't exist. Stand today in the entrance hall of any great Scottish estate, Dunrobin Castle, on the North Sea coast perhaps, or Floors Castle near the English border, and you'll see what wealth looked like when Britain controlled the world. Stone towers climbing 5 stories, libraries holding 10,000 volumes, ballrooms sized for 200 guests, gardens stretching to the horizon. Architecture borrowed from French chateaux and German Schlösser, transplanted to Scottish soil and declared ancestral. These weren't ancient fortresses, they were Victorian inventions. Built between 1840 and 1914 during the peak of British imperial power, funded by fortunes extracted from coal mines, cotton mills, colonial plantations, and railway monopolies. Their owners called them restorations. Historians call them fantasies. The truth lies somewhere between. The guidebooks tell you about the architecture, the baronial style, the Scottish Renaissance details, the imported Italian marble and the hand-carved oak. They mention the family's aristocrats with titles stretching back centuries, industrialists who bought their way into the peerage, shipping magnates who married their daughters to lords. What they don't mention is this. Every stone was lifted by hands that never ate in the dining room. Every carving was cut by craftsmen who lived in cottages without indoor plumbing. Every fire was lit by servants who woke before dawn and worked until midnight for wages that barely covered bread. Behind the fairy tale turrets and the romanticized Highland clans lies a harder arithmetic. These castles were built with empire profits and tenant rents, maintained through systems that concentrated wealth at the top while grinding everyone else beneath. They represent not just architectural achievement, but a specific moment when Britain's ruling class had both the money and the arrogance to rebuild the past, according to their own mythology. This investigation focuses on one castle, in particular we'll call it Glenmore, a composite drawn from multiple estates whose stories intertwine. But through this single property, we'll trace the pattern that defined an era, the industrialist who built it, the architect who designed it, the workers who raised it, the servants who ran it, the decline that followed, and the tourists who visit today, walking through rooms that were built to exclude people exactly like them. Glenmore cost roughly £400,000 to construct between 1870 and 1883. That's over £50 million in modern currency. The annual operating costs ran another £15,000, call it £2 million today, every year, for of us, or at least until the money ran out. The question that haunts every corridor: who paid for this? The official answer is simple. The owner, an industrialist named Sir Robert Thornhill, paid from his personal fortune. But dig deeper and the answer fractures. Welsh miners paid with their lungs, Irish quarrymen paid with their hands, Scottish crofters paid with their land, Indian cotton workers paid with their childhood. The cost gets distributed across an empire. and the castle stands as proof that extraction can be transformed into beauty if you have enough money and distance. This is the complex, morally tangled story of Britain's Victorian castle boom, a story of ambition and exploitation, of craft and cruelty, of dreams built on the backs of people whose names were never recorded. But beneath the marble floors and behind the gilded frames, there's something Britain's heritage industry doesn't want you to see too clearly: the arithmetic of empire, the price of grandeur, and the truth about who really built these monuments while their owners claimed the glory. This is the untold story the British Empire tried to bury. Robert Thornhill was born in 1828 in a Birmingham workshop where his father repaired machinery for the new factories spreading across England's industrial heartland. By 1850, he owned the factory. By 1860, he owned 6 factories, 3 coal mines, and a limestone quarry. By 1870, he was worth over £2 million, a fortune that placed him among Britain's wealthiest men, richer than most titled aristocrats, more powerful than many politicians. He had everything money could buy except the one thing he wanted most: a history that erased Birmingham and wrote him into Scotland's ancient story. So he decided to build one. The site he chose sat on the edge of the Highlands, 200 acres of moorland with a ruined medieval keep barely visible through centuries of neglect. The decision wasn't random. Scotland in 1870 carried a specific cultural weight among England's industrial elite. Queen Victoria had fallen in love with the Highlands, building Balmoral and spending summers there, transforming a landscape that had once signified rebellion and poverty into a symbol of romantic nobility. The old clan system had been destroyed after the Jacobite risings, the people cleared for sheep, but that brutal history was now being repackaged as tartaned pageantry. For men like Thornhill, Scotland offered something England couldn't: the appearance of ancient legitimacy. His grandfather had been a tenant farmer. His father had worked with his hands. Thornhill himself had spent his 20s in counting houses and his 30s in boardrooms, amassing capital through relentless calculation. He understood machinery, credit, and labor efficiency. What he didn't have was lineage. In Victorian Britain, that mattered. Wealth alone didn't guarantee social acceptance among the old aristocracy. You needed a country seat. You needed land. You needed architecture that whispered permanence. Thornhill studied precedents obsessively. He visited Balmoral and took notes on its proportions. He toured Dunrabin and Flore's castle, examining how industrialists before him had translated money into ancestral credibility. He read Walter Scott's novels, absorbing the romanticized Highland mythology that Scott had largely invented. And he hired genealogists to construct a family tree that connected him, however tenuously, to minor Scottish gentry from 3 centuries earlier. The connection was thin enough to be laughable, but once carved in stone above a doorway, who would question it? The land purchase consumed £40,000. The old keep would be preserved as a romantic ruin in the grounds. The new castle would rise beside it, dwarfing it, announcing that the Thornhill fortune had arrived and intended to stay. Robert was 42 years old. He gave himself 15 years to complete construction. He would spend whatever it took, and he would create something so magnificent that his Birmingham origins would be forgotten within a generation, buried beneath Scottish granite and aristocratic pretense. David Bryce was 63 when Thornhill hired him in 1869, already Scotland's most celebrated architect, the man who had defined what Victorian Scotland should look like. His specialty was taking aristocratic clients with new money and giving them old credibility, translating their industrial fortunes into stone towers and turrets that whispered of ancient clans and noble bloodlines. Bryce understood that architecture wasn't just about shelter or even beauty. It was about narrative, about constructing a past that never quite existed, but felt more real than memory. His commissions across Scotland, from Fettes College in Edinburgh to Blair Castle in Perthshire, shared a common language: steep roofs, corbelled turrets, crow-stepped gables, baronial confidence rendered in granite and sandstone. Bryce arrived at the Glenmore site in October 1869, travelling by railway from Edinburgh, and then by carriage over rough Highland tracks. He walked the grounds for 3 days, studying sight lines and elevations, noting where the land rose and fell, marking the point where the mountains framed the valley most dramatically. He made sketches in charcoal and watercolor, not just of buildings but of atmospheric effects: morning mist rising from the glen, evening light catching stone at particular angles. His proposal, delivered to Thornhill in December, called for a castle of approximately 60 rooms arranged across 4 floors with a tower climbing 90 feet at the southwestern corner. The style he termed Scottish baronial, a Victorian invention that blended elements from medieval tower houses, Renaissance palaces, and pure fantasy. The facade would be asymmetrical, following the picturesque principles popularized by the Romantic movement: no cold, classical symmetry, but organic groupings of towers, gables, and chimney stacks that appeared to have accumulated over centuries rather than being built all at once. Bryce specified materials with precision. Granite from Aberdeenshire for the exterior walls, chosen for its durability and the subtle colour variations that would give texture to the facade. Sandstone from Dumfriesshire for decorative elements: window surrounds, corbels, carved heraldry. Slate from Argyll for the steeply pitched roofs. Oak from Scotland's remaining old-growth forests for the principal interiors. Every choice balanced aesthetics with a statement of Scottish authenticity, even though the client was English and the money came from Birmingham industry. The drawings were extraordinary. Bryce rendered the castle from multiple angles, showed it in different seasons and times of day, included human figures for scale ladies in crinolines on the terrace, Gillis with deer in the foreground, carriages approaching through landscaped grounds. These weren't technical drawings but selling documents, visual arguments designed to make Thornhill see himself as laird of an ancient estate. The cost estimate came to £180,000. Thornhill approved it without negotiation. Construction would begin in spring. Construction began in April 1870. The first task wasn't glamorous. Clear the site, drain the bog, cut a road capable of bearing loaded wagons from the nearest railway siding 4 miles distant. Thornhill hired a contractor from Glasgow who brought in crews from across Scotland and Ireland, men desperate for work in an era when a bad harvest or a closed factory meant starvation. They arrived with shovels and picks, sleeping in timber barracks thrown up in a week, eating porridge and bread, working dawn to dusk 6 days a week. The pay was 9 shillings for a labourer, 15 for a skilled mason, deducted for tools and lodging. The workforce peaked at over 300 men during the summers of 1871 and 1872. They came from the lowlands and the highlands, from Ireland's western counties, from the slums of Glasgow and Edinburgh. Some were experienced construction workers following the railway building boom. Others were crofters whose tenancies had been terminated to make room for sheep or deer forests, men with agricultural skills but little experience handling cut stone or reading architectural plans. Site conditions were brutal. The Scottish weather turned construction into a war of attrition. Rain could halt work for days, turning excavations into mud pits and making scaffolding treacherous. Winter froze mortar and made stone handling dangerous. Fingers went numb. Tools slipped. Accidents multiplied. The barracks offered minimal shelter, timber walls that leaked and bunks stacked 3 high with straw mattresses shared between shifts. Injuries were routine and largely unrecorded. A labourer crushed by a fallen stone received no compensation if the contractor deemed it his own carelessness. A mason who couldn't work due to injury was simply dismissed. Medical care was rudimentary. A local doctor visited weekly, but serious cases had to travel to Inverness, a journey that could take a day. Some men didn't survive it. The granite blocks arrived by rail from Aberdeenshire quarries, each stone weighing between 1 and 3 tons. They were offloaded at the siding and transferred to wagons pulled by teams of horses over the newly cut road. The road itself required constant maintenance. Ruts appeared overnight. Bridges over burns needed reinforcement. Gradients had to be kept manageable for loaded wagons. A separate crew did nothing but road work, filling holes and laying gravel. At the site, stonemasons worked in teams, dressing blocks to Bryce's exact specifications. Each stone had to fit precisely with its neighbors, creating walls 4 feet thick at the base, tapering to 3 feet higher up. The masons used traditional techniques, wooden templates for curves, plumb lines for vertical alignment, carefully mixed mortar that would cure slowly and evenly. Speed was impossible. Quality was everything. These walls were meant to last centuries. While the towers climbed and the turrets took shape, another structure was rising beneath the service world that would make the fantasy function. Basement corridors stretching 200 feet. Kitchens the size of small houses with coal ranges that burned continuously. Sculleries, pantries, wine cellars, cold stores packed with ice cut from Highland lochs each winter. Servant bedrooms in the attics, narrow and cold, furnished with iron beds and shared washstands. This was the machinery of Victorian grandeur, the invisible infrastructure that let wealthy families live as though comfort arrived by magic, rather than through the exhausting labor of dozens of people working roles so precisely choreographed that a single mistake of fire, unlit, a dish poorly timed, a staircase crossed at the wrong moment could mean instant dismissal. Bryce's plans devoted as much attention to the service areas as to the staterooms. He understood that a great house was essentially 2 buildings occupying the same footprint: the public palace where the family lived and entertained, and the hidden factory where servants worked. The 2 worlds connected through specific transition point service doors concealed in paneling, back staircases that allowed staff to move between floors without being seen, corridors that ran parallel to grand hallways but remained perpetually off-limits to guests. The basement kitchens occupied the entire northern range. The main kitchen featured 3 coal ranges, each 6 feet long, capable of roasting multiple courses simultaneously. Temperatures inside could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit during dinner preparation. Adjacent to the main kitchen sat the scullery where dishes were washed in stone sinks using water heated in copper boilers. Beyond that, the pastry kitchen with its own range and marble-topped preparation tables kept cool for working butter and dough. Storage was elaborate and specialized. The wine cellar, temperature-controlled through careful ventilation and northern exposure, could hold 3,000 bottles in floor-to-ceiling racks. The dry goods pantry stored flour, sugar, and preserved foods in labeled containers. The game larder, lined with slate and fitted with mesh screens against flies, hung venison, grouse, and pheasant. The ice house, dug deep into the hillside with double-insulated walls, preserved ice cut from frozen lochs each January and stored under sawdust to last through summer. Servant quarters occupied the attic level under the steep slate roofs. The rooms were small, approximately 8 by 10 feet, with sloped ceilings that made standing upright possible only in the center. Each room held an iron bedstead, a washstand with basin and pitcher, a small chest of drawers, and hooks for hanging clothes. Windows were narrow. Heating was non-existent. In winter, frost formed on the inside of the glass. Maids woke before dawn to light fires in family bedrooms, emerging from their own freezing quarters to create warmth for others. The construction ledgers survived, stored now in the Scottish archives, and they tell a story the castle's polished surfaces don't reveal. Total expenditure by 1883 is £427,000, broken down. £180,000 for stone and materials, £95,000 for skilled labour, £62,000 for interior furnishings, £45,000 for landscaping, £45,000 for what the ledger calls sundry expenses, bribes to railway companies for priority shipping, payments to local landowners for access roads, compensation to crofters displaced when Thornhill expanded his deer forest. But the ledgers don't record everything. An unmarked grave. They don't count the stonemason who fell from scaffolding in 1872 and was buried in an unmarked grave. They don't mention the quarryman who lost 3 fingers to a badly set charge. The numbers demand context. In 1870, a skilled craftsman in England earned approximately £75 per year. a labourer made perhaps £40. The pound 427,000 Thornhill spent on Glenmore represented the combined lifetime earnings of roughly 4,000 working men. Put another way, one castle cost what 4,000 families might earn across an entire generation of labour. Where did that money come from? Thornhill's fortune rested on three pillars. First, his coal mines in South Wales, where men descended into darkness for shifts that could run 12 hours, breathing air thick with dust that would kill many before they reached 50. Second, his limestone quarries in Ireland, where workers used explosives and hand tools to blast stone from hillsides, paid by the ton with no compensation for injuries or death. Third, his investments in railway companies and manufacturing concerns, holdings that generated reliable dividends without requiring his direct involvement. The human cost extended beyond wages. Construction deaths were neither investigated nor publicly recorded in any systematic way, but surviving correspondence mentions several fatalities. A letter from the site foreman to Bryce in August 1872 notes that work was delayed because a scaffolding collapse killed 2 men and injured 4 others. The injured received no compensation. Their families received nothing. The foreman's concern was purely logistical: how quickly could replacement workers be found? Accidents were treated as inevitable. A mason cutting stone might have his hand crushed by a slipped chisel or a falling block. If he could no longer work, he was dismissed. Industrial safety regulations barely existed. Workers' compensation laws wouldn't pass Parliament until 1897, too late for the men who built Glenmore. The assumption, rarely stated but universally understood, was that labourers accepted risk as part of employment. If they didn't like the terms, others would take their place. Even outside of accidents, the work damaged bodies systematically. Stone dust accumulated in lungs, causing silicosis that would manifest years later. Heavy lifting bent spines and destroyed joints. Exposure to cold and wet triggered rheumatism and respiratory illnesses. Most construction workers who survived to 60 carried permanent physical damage from their trade. The fortune that built Glenmore didn't begin in Scotland. It began in Welsh valleys where coal seams ran deep and miners worked in darkness. In Lancashire mills where cotton imported from Indian plantations was spun by children whose fingers moved faster than adults. In Irish quarries where limestone was cut and shipped to English ports. Thornhill's wealth was fundamentally extractive, built on the back of empire systems that moved raw materials from colony to metropole and transformed them into profit that pooled in very few hands. The connection between a Rajasthani cotton field and a Scottish turret wasn't metaphorical, it was direct, transactional, and carefully hidden beneath layers of corporate ownership and aristocratic marriage. Follow the money backward from Glenmore's construction accounts, and the empire reveals itself. The granite came from Aberdeenshire, quarried by Scottish workers, but it was transported on railways built with capital raised in London from investors whose wealth derived from colonial trade. The oak for interior joinery was Scottish, where possible, but exotic hardwoods mahogany for library shelving, teak for outdoor furniture came from British Honduras and Burma, logged by colonized labour and shipped on British vessels. Thornhill's coal operations in South Wales employed approximately 800 men and boys. Shifts ran from dawn until dark. Boys as young as 8 worked as trappers, sitting alone in the darkness, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal carts passed. Older boys pushed carts. Men worked the coal face with picks and explosives, lying on their sides in seams sometimes less than 3 feet high, breathing air thick with dust and gas. Pay was structured to maximize Thornhill's profit. Miners were paid by the ton of coal extracted, not by the hour, which incentivized speed over safety and made earnings unpredictable. A good week might bring 20 shillings. A poor week, when equipment failed or seams proved difficult, might yield half that. The company store, operated by Thornhill's managers, sold food and supplies on credit at inflated prices, ensuring that many miners finished each month in debt despite their labour. The limestone quarries in County Clare followed similar patterns. Irish labourers blasted stone from hillsides using black powder, working piece rates that guaranteed Thornhill's costs remained low. The stone was shipped to Bristol and distributed across England for construction and agricultural lime. The operation employed roughly 200 men. Fatal accidents occurred several times per year. No compensation, no investigation, just replacement workers drawn from a pool of desperate rural poor. Thornhill also held shares in textile operations that processed Indian cotton. The connection was indirect. He owned stock in Manchester mills that purchased raw cotton from suppliers who operated across the subcontinent, but the profits that funded Glenmore's construction flowed along these routes. Cotton picked by Indian hands, shipped to English factories, woven into cloth by Lancashire workers, sold at prices that generated returns for investors like Thornhill. This was empire economics, raw materials extracted from colonies, processed in British factories using cheap domestic labour, sold globally at prices that generated wealth for a tiny investor class who then built monuments to their own success. By 1885, Glenmore employed 83 people. The hierarchy was rigid and absolute. At the top, the butler, who managed the male staff and controlled the wine cellar, earning £80 per year. The housekeeper, who commanded the female staff and guarded the linen inventory, earning £60. Below them, footmen, ladies' maids, valets, under-butlers. Further down, housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids. At the bottom, hall boys and scullery girls, children often, working for £8 a year plus room and board. Each servant had a defined role, a prescribed uniform, a TA-specific staircase. The system functioned because everyone knew their place and because the alternative unemployment, workhouse, starvation was always visible just beyond the estate gates. The day began before the family woke. Housemaids rose at 5, dressed in work clothes, and descended the back stairs to the kitchens. Their first task was clearing yesterday's ashes from fireplaces throughout the house and laying fresh fires. This had to be completed before family members stirred, so fires appeared magically lit, rooms warm without visible effort. A housemaid might service 10 fireplaces in an hour, moving silently through rooms, careful not to disturb the family or mark carpets with coal dust. Kitchen staff started even earlier. The scullery maid, lowest in the hierarchy, arrived at 4:30 to light the range fires and begin heating water for the day's cooking and cleaning. By 5, the cook and kitchen maids were preparing breakfast. For the family, porridge, kippers, eggs, toast, preserves. For the servants, porridge and bread, eaten quickly in the servants' hall before work resumed. Footmen polished silver, cleaned boots, and prepared the dining room. The butler inspected their work, checking that each fork gleamed, that glassware showed no spots, that the table was set to exact specifications. Mistakes were noted and punished. Repeated errors meant dismissal without reference, effectively ending a servant's career. The lady's maid attended to Thornhill's wife and daughters, helping them dress, arranging hair, maintaining wardrobes. This was skilled work requiring knowledge of fashion, fabric care, and social protocols. A good lady's maid earned relative autonomy and trust. A poor one faced immediate replacement. The position offered proximity to the family but also constant surveillance behavior. Speech, even facial expressions were monitored. Lunch and dinner required orchestrated precision. The cook directed multiple courses prepared simultaneously. Kitchen maids chopped vegetables, stirred sauces, and assembled dishes under pressure. Footmen carried courses from kitchen to dining room via heated serving trolleys, timing their arrival so food reached the table at proper temperature. The family noticed only if something went wrong. Afternoons brought cleaning, laundry, and preparation for evening. Housemaids swept, dusted, and polished. The laundress and her assistants washed linens by hand, using harsh lye soap and pounding paddles, then hung everything to dry in dedicated rooms. Delicate items were hand-washed separately. Ironing consumed hours, heating heavy flat irons on the range and working through mountains of sheets, shirts, and tablecloths. Evenings repeated the morning's choreography in reverse. Fires were tended, beds were turned down, nightclothes were laid out. The family's evening concluded with servants ensuring everything was ready for the next day's beginning. The first cracks appeared during the agricultural depression of the 1880s when falling grain prices across Europe hammered the rental income from Thornhill's tenant farms. Then came death duties in 1894, a new tax on inherited wealth that began to drain aristocratic fortunes with each generational transfer. Thornhill died in 1897. His son inherited the estate and immediately faced a choice: cut costs or face bankruptcy within a decade. Staff numbers fell from 83 to 47. Wings of the castle were closed, furniture draped in dust sheets, fires no longer lit, maintenance deferred. The roof began to leak, stone weathered without repair. By 1920, the family was selling art to pay taxes. The mathematical reality was straightforward and brutal. Glenmore's annual operating costs in 1897 stood at approximately £15,000 ZAR. Income from tenant farms, timber sales, and investments generated perhaps £8,000 in a good year. The £7,000 shortfall had been covered by Thornhill's industrial income dividends and rents from his Welsh and Irish operations. But when those assets passed to his son, they were taxed. The estate itself was taxed. Legal fees consumed tens of thousands. The capital base shrank. Thornhill's son, Robert Jr., attempted economies immediately. The first target was staff. Within a year of his father's death, he dismissed 20 household servants and 10 estate workers. The butler retired and wasn't replaced. Footmen decreased from 6 to 2. The indoor staff that had numbered 60 now numbered 30. Each dismissal saved wages but reduced capacity. Tasks that had been performed daily now occurred weekly. Standards slipped. Whole sections of the castle were closed. The east wing, containing 12 guest bedrooms and 2 sitting rooms, was shuttered. Furniture was covered with dust sheets. Shutters were closed. Heating was cut. Similar closures followed in 1902 and 1905 until only the central block and part of the west wing remained in use. The family, which had once spread across 20 rooms, now confined itself to 8. Maintenance deferred as maintenance multiplied. Water penetrating through worn roof slates damaged plaster ceilings. Frost cracked stonework. Window frames rotted where paint had worn away. Each small failure, left unaddressed, metastasized into larger structural problems that would eventually cost far more to repair than prevention would have required. But prevention required cash the estate no longer possessed. Robert Jr. sold first the portable valuables. Paintings went to London auction houses. Furniture found buyers among American collectors furnishing Gilded Age mansions. Family silver was melted down for bullion when prices were favorable. Each sale generated temporary relief, but permanently reduced the estate's cultural assets. By 1914, the art collection that Thornhill Sr. had assembled was largely dispersed. The Great War accelerated decline. Death duties doubled in 1914 and climbed again in 1919. Income tax, minimal before the war, rose to fund military expenditure and never fully retreated in peace. Agricultural rents collapsed as returning soldiers demanded land reform. Timber prices fell when wartime demand ended. The Great War took 23 men from the estate, and the village gamekeepers, stable hands, gardeners, the second footman. 12 didn't return. The names are carved on a memorial in the village kirk, but what's not recorded is how their absence broke the estate's operating rhythm. There weren't enough hands to maintain the gardens. The deer forest went unmanaged. Poaching increased. Meanwhile, income tax rose to fund the war, and death duties climbed again in 1919. The Thornhill family, like aristocratic families across Britain, discovered that the systems which had sustained their wealth for generations were being dismantled by democratic governments that needed revenue and had lost patience with hereditary privilege. The war memorial stands in the village kirkyard, a simple granite column with names carved in alphabetical order. Duncan Campbell, gamekeeper; James Fraser, undergardener; Thomas MacLeod, stable hand. The list runs to 23 names from a community of perhaps 200 souls. 12 have dates of death. The rest came home carrying wounds visible and otherwise. The estate's functioning depended on a stable workforce. Groundsmen maintained 30 acres of formal gardens, orchards, and pleasure grounds. Gamekeepers managed the deer forest and grouse moors that provided sport for Thornhill's shooting parties. Foresters worked the commercial timber stands. Stable hands cared for horses, maintained carriages, and later serviced motor vehicles. When these men left for war, their positions couldn't easily be filled. Women and older men took some roles, but knowledge accumulated over years which trees to cull, where deer gathered seasonally, how to maintain specific garden features departed with the men and often didn't return. The financial pressure was worse. Before 1914, income tax in Britain stood at approximately 5% for the highest earners. By 1918, it had risen to 30%. Death duties, the inheritance tax charged when property passed to the next generation, climbed from 8% in 1914 to 40% by 1919. These weren't abstract policy changes. They were direct extractions from the capital that sustained estates like Glenmore. Robert Jr., who had inherited in 1897 and spent 2 decades managing decline, died in 1923. His son inherited what remained. The death duty assessment came to £145,000. The estate didn't have liquid capital to pay. Land was sold. Tenant farms that had been part of Thornhill Holdings for 40 years went to new owners. Timber was clear-cut and sold at depression prices. Art and furnishings that had survived earlier sales went to auction. By 1925, the Glenmore estate had shrunk from its 1885 peak of 4,000 acres to barely 800. The castle itself sat at the center, increasingly isolated from the productive land that had once supported it. Operating costs, though reduced, still exceeded income. The family discussed selling entirely but found no buyers. Who wanted a 60-room castle in the Highlands during an agricultural depression? The social order was shifting beneath them. Labor unions gained strength. Minimum wage laws appeared. Servants demanded better conditions or left for factory work that offered shorter hours and more autonomy. The automatic deference that had sustained the master-servant relationship weakened. Political power was democratizing as voting rights expanded beyond property owners. The transformation began quietly in 1936, when the family opened 3 rooms to paying visitors on Wednesday afternoons during summer. Admission, 1 shilling. The idea was both desperate and revolutionary, admitting that the private palace could no longer function privately, that survival required turning heritage into commodity. By 1950, the entire ground floor was open. By 1970, the family had moved into a wing and the castle operated essentially as a business. Guides led tours. A room opened in the old servants' hall. The gift shop sold postcards and shortbread. What had been built as the ultimate statement of private wealth became public entertainment, its survival dependent on tourists paying to see how the other half had lived. The decision to open to visitors was made reluctantly by Thornhill's grandson after years of failed alternatives. Selling was impossible. No market existed for Scottish castles during the Depression. The family couldn't afford to maintain the building without additional income, but couldn't generate income without compromising the privacy the castle had been built to protect. Opening 3 rooms was presented as temporary, a stopgap until conditions improved. It became permanent. The initial arrangement was modest. Visitors entered through a side door on Wednesday afternoons between May and September. A housekeeper led small groups through the library, the drawing room, and the great hall, explaining architectural features and pointing out paintings. The tour lasted approximately 40 minutes. Visitors paid their shilling and departed through the gift area where postcards and a small guidebook were available for purchase. Attendance the first summer was roughly 800 people, generating £40 in revenue. This barely covered the cost of staff time and heating the rooms, but it established proof of concept. People would pay to see inside a castle. The following summer, opening days expanded to Tuesdays and Thursdays as well. Attendance doubled. By 1939, the castle was receiving 4,000 visitors annually. The Second World War halted tourism but provided another revenue stream. The military requisitioned part of the castle for storage and administrative offices, paying rent that kept the family solvent through the war years. When peace returned, tourism resumed with new vigor. The 1950s brought automobile travel to the masses. Middle-class Britons with paid holidays and disposable income began touring Scotland. Glenmore's location on a main touring route proved fortunate. By 1960, annual visitors exceeded 20,000. The operation had professionalized. Trained guides replaced family members. The tour expanded to include the basement kitchens and servant quarters, reframed as historical curiosities. A tea room opened in the old servants' hall, serving scones and tea to visitors who sat at tables where housemaids had once eaten breakfast. The gift shop expanded, offering clan tartans, Highland crafts, and branded merchandise. The family's relationship to the building shifted fundamentally. What had been a private residence they happened to show became a heritage attraction they happened to live in. Family quarters shrank to a private wing. The rest existed for public consumption. Privacy was traded for survival. The castle would endure, but not as originally intended. Today, Glenmore receives over 200 Siraus-on visitors annually. It's a triumph of adaptive reuse, a model for how historic properties can survive by opening their doors. But there's a tension at the heart of the enterprise. The tours emphasize beauty and craftsmanship, the vision of the builder, the skill of the architect. They're less forthcoming about labor conditions, empire profits, or the systems of inequality that made construction possible. Visitors walk through servant quarters now, but the narrative frames this as historical curiosity rather than moral reckoning. The guidebook mentions that the castle employed many local people, true enough, but incomplete. It doesn't mention that those people worked 14-hour days for wages that kept them perpetually on the edge. The standard tour lasts 90 minutes. It begins in the great hall where guides point out the hammer-beam ceiling, the carved heraldry above the fireplace, the family portraits lining the walls. The narrative emphasizes Thornhill's vision and determination, his love of Scotland, his commitment to creating something permanent. This isn't false, it's simply incomplete. In the library, visitors admire the floor-to-ceiling oak shelving and the collection of first editions. The guide mentions that Thornhill assembled one of Scotland's finest private libraries. What's typically not mentioned, the books were dusted weekly by housemaids who earned £15 per year and were forbidden from reading them. The drawing room showcases French furniture and Italian paintings. The guide notes that Thornhill traveled extensively, acquiring pieces from across Europe. Less discussed, how industrial profits enabled that acquisition, or what conditions existed in the Welsh mines that generated the capital for continental shopping trips. The basement kitchens are presented as a marvel of Victorian technology: the coal ranges, the copper pots, the elaborate infrastructure. Visitors photograph the servants' bells and marvel at the complexity. The narrative frames this as ingenious design solving logistical challenges. It rarely frames it as a system for extracting maximum labor while keeping workers invisible. The servant quarters in the attics are similarly sanitized. The rooms are small, yes, and the beds narrow, but the presentation emphasizes how well the servants were housed compared to urban slums. This is true as far as it goes, but it stops short of discussing how the entire system rested on exploitation on paying workers less than the value they created and pocketing the difference. The guidebook, available in English, French, and German, runs to 48 glossy pages. It contains detailed floor plans, architectural history, family genealogy, and photographs of principal rooms. It has one paragraph on servants and 2 sentences on construction workers. The bibliography lists sources on Scottish baronial architecture and Victorian design, but nothing on labor history or empire economics. This isn't malicious, it's strategic. Heritage tourism sells romance and beauty, not complicity and exploitation. Visitors want to imagine themselves in ball gowns descending the grand staircase, not scrubbing floors at dawn. The business model rewards celebration, not critique. Glenmore's survival depends on remaining appealing. Too much honesty about how beauty was built might complicate the brand. Walk through Glenmore today and look carefully. The evidence is everywhere if you know how to read it. Servants' bells still hang in the corridors, each connected to a specific room upstairs, each representing a summons that had to be answered immediately. The basement kitchens still show scorch marks on the walls from coal ranges that burned at brutal temperatures. The attic bedrooms where maids slept are tiny, cold, furnished now, as museum pieces but once home to teenage girls who woke at 5 and worked until midnight. The stone walls themselves carry mason's marks, actually, small symbols chiseled by individual craftsmen to track their work and claim their pay, the only signature most of these builders ever left. The bells hang silent now behind glass panels in the servant corridors. Each bell is labeled library, drawing room, master bedroom, ladies' chamber. When one rang, a servant had to respond within minutes. The system assumed constant availability, that servants existed in a state of permanent readiness to serve needs they couldn't predict or control. In the basement kitchens, look at the walls near the ranges. The stone is discolored by a century of heat and smoke. Scorch marks trace where flames occasionally escaped the firebox. These ranges burned coal continuously during the social season. The heat inside the kitchen could exceed 90 degrees. Cooks and kitchen maids worked in these conditions for hours, producing elaborate meals while family and guests dined in comfortable temperature-controlled rooms above. The scullery sinks are deep stone basins worn smooth by decades of scrubbing. The work done here was brutal washing dishes, pots and pans in water heated laboriously in copper boilers, using harsh soaps that cracked hands and caustic chemicals that burned skin. The scullery maid was often the youngest, newest servant, given the worst job until someone younger arrived to replace her. Climb to the attic and examine the servant bedrooms. The doorways are low. The rooms measure perhaps 8 by 10 feet. Sloped ceilings follow the roofline. A single narrow window provides limited light. The iron bedstead is short by modern standards. The washstand holds a basin and pitcher for cold water carried upstairs daily. In winter, ice formed on the inside of the window glass. Servants slept in these rooms but spent minimal waking time there. They existed for sleeping only. Look closely at the exterior stonework. On many blocks you'll find small symbols carved discreetly near the base. Crosses, triangles, initials, abstract shapes. These are masons' marks, identifying symbols individual stonemasons cut into their work. The marks served practical purposes, tracking which mason cut which blocks for payment and quality control. But they also served as signatures, the only permanent record that specific men worked on this building. Parish records in the village kirk name some of the masons: Duncan McIntyre, Alexander Cameron, Robert Grant. Their marks can sometimes be matched to surviving tools or apprenticeship records. Most marks, however, remain anonymous. We know someone cut that stone, placed it precisely, made this building possible. We don't know who. The architecture preserves memory whether it intends to or not. The grandeur speaks to wealth and ambition. But the scorch marks, the worn sinks, the cramped attic rooms, the masons' marks, these tell parallel stories of labor and limitation, of lives spent creating beauty others would enjoy, of work that built permanence for people who had none.